Welcome to Parallax Views, an IEA series of discussions about the politics of culture with specific reference to freedom of speech. My name is Marc Glendening, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Marc Sidwell, a journalist and publisher of long standing with the New Statesman, The Telegraph, City AM. He's a fellow at the New Culture Forum. Last year I had the great pleasure of discussing with him his then recently published book, The Long March, an invaluable analysis of the New Left across the Western world. The IEA has recently published his follow-up paper, A Silent Revolution, The Intellectual Origins of Cancel Culture. And that is what we're going to discuss today. Cancel culture is something of a mystery to many people. It seems to have only recently exploded onto the political scene. It's difficult to grasp conceptually and organizationally, unlike previous forms of totalitarian and authoritarian politics such as fascism and Marxism. And so it ends up being described in an often rather semi-jocular way, such as terms like woke and political correctness. And Marc's paper is really hugely helpful in helping us to appreciate the true and very illiberal significance of this new political tendency. Marc, in your paper you say that the intellectual and political antecedents of cancel culture have their origins way back in the 1920s and 30s, and I was wondering if you could run through some of the key currents of thought, personalities, movements that you feel are important in this regard.
Of course, and thank you again, Marc. It's always a pleasure to sit down with you and discuss these issues in this sort of friendly and intelligent forum. One of the things I was trying to do with this paper, because as you say, people look around, most normal people who don't pay too much attention to these things, and think, well, what is this thing that suddenly turned up in the last 2 minutes? It's very strange, it seems quite extreme, and it wasn't there yesterday. But the truth is that these sorts of big intellectual changes, big cultural changes, can have very deep roots and can have very long periods of time in which they're influenced before they suddenly emerge and then seem as if they've only just appeared overnight. And indeed, the IEA understands this very well itself, and certainly its foundation, which is inspired by the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, were really about how you change culture over a long period of time, rather than just worrying about the headlines, but thinking about these deeper questions of how you shift the intellectual mindset and perhaps get them, in the case of the IEA, of course, to think more in terms of market liberalism and the power of freedom. Now, before the IEA and Hayek was thinking about that, perhaps the most important group that really started thinking in this way, and in Britain, were the Fabians, because, and this is going back a little further, sort of Bernard Shaw time, they took the idea of revolution and they said, well, okay, but we don't want to do it violently, and we want to do it not through the workers, but by influencing the intellectual movement. So we won't just talk to our own, we'll try and find people across the spectrum, and we'll just infiltrate our ideas, and slowly over time, we will change the culture. And the reason they're called the Fabians is after a Roman general, Fabius, who notoriously had a very slow strategy against the Carthaginians, which proved successful. This way of changing culture is very powerful and effective, but it's slow. And so people don't always see it coming. And so the Fabians is really the first time you see that coming in the UK. And of course, in some ways it comes into its full flower after the Second World War, and you get a lot of really radical policy changes, because the Fabians, again, believed in this idea of when you strike hard. Their symbol used to be a tortoise with its arm in the air saying strike hard, and it meant you go slowly, you prepare the ground, and then when the moment comes, you strike. but particularly in the interwar years, which is what you mentioned, well, what started to happen was that people who'd believed very much in the communist revolution were starting to be concerned that they weren't getting the inroads in the industrial countries that they'd hoped for in the industrial West. And of course, Russia, great revolutionary situation, was really an agrarian peasant economy. And it was thought that it should be the industrial economies that were really rising up and seeing the attraction of communism. And that wasn't happening. So that started to create a movement to think differently about communism and revolution, and think specifically in terms that suited the West. And really that was the beginning, even more than the Fabians, of a sort of cultural slow motion approach to revolution in the West. How would you bring it to the West? And that's really, I think, where the very roots of what has become cancel culture today, and would later become the New Left in the sort of 1960s and 70s, begins.
You mention critical theory, which comes out of the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
And we see updated manifestations of it today with critical race theory, critical legal theory, as you say in the paper. I was just wondering if you'd like to say a bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, so these people who were trying to think in these interwar years about what you do about revolution in the West and how you perhaps adapt Marxist thought. Very important in that was the role of the Frankfurt School, which was created explicitly with that aim, perhaps with some connection to the Fabians. Certainly there were people who travelled in the UK and knew about the Fabian approach, but also very much looking to Russia and Moscow and some of the institutes they have there. It was ironically, it was a very, very wealthy grain merchant's money who was used to set it up. But they were trying to think differently. They were trying to think about how you get to revolution in a rather different way. And what became really their signature intellectual move was the idea of critical theory, of how you turn academic inquiry into something that's explicitly revolutionary, that stands outside the status quo, stands really on the side of the oppressed as they see it, and works out how to effectively tear it down, what's wrong with it. So it's a stance of negation of the way things are. And this is a hard thing for people to engage with, because I think a lot of people look at what's going on now and they say, well, but I want things to improve and I change and I care about discrimination and racism and all these things, of course. But there is an enormous difference between a movement that is, let's say, meliorist, that tries to make things better within the existing system and likes how things are, and something which is at its root revolutionary and says, well, obviously the only answer is to tear everything down and start again. And really, critical theory is a way of turning academic inquiry from something more neutral and objective and within the system to something that is explicitly revolutionary, and asking how can we bring it down, because obviously and unlike most academic inquiry, it already knows what the answer is. It knows the answer is revolution and is then seeking to further that through its inquiries.
So it's really about, unlike Marxism, which was specifically a critique of capitalism and wanted to see a socialist revolution and change in that kind of specific sphere of human activity. It's really a trashing of the entire culture. Every sort of dimension of existence becomes characterized as a form of domination, a form of oppression. And so there's a very kind of nihilistic quality, is there not, to critical theory and its later manifestations?
Yes. So one of the really interesting things about this critical theory and its trashing of the whole culture, it is nihilistic, but it's also because it sees the entire culture as inflected with capitalism. And capitalism, from those interwar years and all the way up to today, is seen in this intellectual movement as fascist, or as at least proto-fascist. And that, again, can be quite hard to understand. People who kind of like capitalism or like the way things are think, well, we fought against fascism, we don't like fascism. But that is not what they saw. They saw fascism not as some rival totalitarianism alongside communism, but as specifically, if you like, the end point of capitalism. And later on, the New Left in America would say things like, and this was widely accepted, that, you know, to be bourgeois is to be almost a Nazi. You don't need the signs of some organised Nazi party, you just need capitalism, and it's already heading there. So this gave a new urgency, and maybe renewed again by the World War II, of course, that you were fighting against something truly terrible, that the entire capitalist West was one step away from death camps and jackboots. And that was a very powerful thing, and it remains one today. Of course, you get the Antifa, the anti-fascist protests, but it's anti-fascism is a very large umbrella that basically includes modern capitalism in all its forms, really.
And yes, and includes kind of everything, so that people who simply don't go along with, say, somebody, you know, of impeccably centre-left political origins, like the writer Lionel Shriver, but who don't go along with the new left ideology, then become classified as white supremacist and alt-right. So there's this extraordinary kind of elastication of the concept of fascism to take in anybody who isn't actually a fascist, but simply doesn't go along, you know, silence is violence. That's and so therefore you can label anybody and censor anybody who disagrees with you.
Yeah, the entire system is systemically proto-fascist, or you know, essentially evil. Something much better could be created. So of course anyone who disagrees with that is by implication fascist. And you see, as you say, this great elastication of concepts, which makes it very hard to talk, because it's very hard to understand what's going on, because a white supremacist, in the sense that we would normally understand it, and most people did until about 2 seconds ago, is, you know, someone who puts on white sheets and you know, lynches people and you know, believes in white power and all of that, whereas now it would be just someone who thinks that society is okay and maybe we should do something about individual racists rather than that. So, you know, these are extraordinary widening of the concepts, and language sort of loses its normal force. One reason you can't have the conversations is you're talking in two different sort of uses of the same words.
The section on the Frankfurt School in your paper is fascinating, because it helps to explain, I think, why so many people on the New Left today sort of detest the legacy of Enlightenment, Western rationality. Do you see a connection between that disparaging of the Enlightenment, which we would see as a very liberal and liberatory movement? Does that help to explain why many on the New Left are so enamored by postmodernist ideas, do you think?
I think it could be. It's interesting. You know, the Frankfurt School academics were brilliant men. I mean, these were extremely clever men. They were wrong in ways that, you know, you have to be extremely sophisticated intellectually to think yourself into these corners. And of course, they did have honest reasons for being very worried about fascism. They came to America as refugees from Nazism and all of that. They just unfortunately saw America as bigger problem. But they were very bright, and they were thinking all this through. And yet, you know, they wrote things like the Dialectics of Enlightenment. They were really concerned about, with this critical theory method, that they were sort of, as they were very clever people who were digging underneath themselves all the time and tearing it down. And I don't think they always understood quite how far it was going. It's interesting, there's an interview with Marcuse later in his life when he's a real guru, sort of a key figure of that movement. And he's trying to tell all these young students, well, no, what you need to do is you need to sit down and learn German. Everyone's going to read Marx in the original, and, you know, this is how you get a revolution. You think really hard and you learn properly. And they're all like anti-intellectual, no, we'll go to the streets, we'll burn libraries down, that'll be the future. And he sort of tries to resist. I don't think they always saw how far it would go. So they were intellectuals who were bringing the revolution to the world of academia and saying, well, we need to recruit intellectuals in academia rather than worry about the workers to get this done. And they were probably right in that. But at the same time, they constantly had this anti-intellectual streak in what they were doing that tore that ground out from under them. And unfortunately now, because the academy has essentially been in many ways colonized by these ideas, it becomes less rigorous and less intellectual in that process, because, as I said earlier, it sort of already knows what the answer is in some ways. And then you get these postmodern ideas where reality itself, truth itself, becomes something of a sort of free-floating concept, that you're not trying to have a sort of shared reality that you can agree on, which is a dangerous place to be. It's sort of very hard to find any agreement, as well as any reality on which to base proper inquiry.
Yes, and I suppose one of the reasons that postmodernism, following on from what you've just said, is so attractive to elements on the contemporary, if not the traditional, rational left, is that it enables people who want a new type of society, who want a sort of cultural year zero, to sort of dismiss the metaphysical objective constraints within which we live in reality. I think you see this most prominently at the moment with the whole transgender ideology, whereby they argue that a biological objective male can simultaneously be a woman just by asserting that he's a woman. And so long as society is coerced into accepting this, then that is the new reality. And so once you go down that road, you are on the path, I think, to something sort of totalitarian. But it's a different journey towards totalitarianism from the old scientistic, if you like, sort of Marxist approach. It's actually weirdly a form of epistemological anarchism, but which only some people are allowed to participate in, and others are just simply not allowed to challenge it. And that's where I think some of the anti-free speech thing comes in.
Yeah, I think so very much. I think a lot of market liberals focused on the idea in the past, in the Cold War, that seeking economic equality of outcomes might be a nice idea, but it was extremely dangerous, and that if you did that, you're going to end up with these vast bureaucracies of control, oppression, and actually end up with a lot of poverty. A lot of people came to see that. Tony Blair and New Labour came to see that. But there's a sort of parallel strand, which is what really in the New Left's corner, which says, well, okay, but never mind about that. We're interested in social and cultural equality. And we're going to seek that. And you can't worry about those kinds of equalities of outcomes because there's nothing to do with economics. And you've been arguing about economics. And people haven't been immunised against that in the same way, so they sort of nod along and go, plenty of conservative MPs, PMs like Theresa May would nod along and say, well, yeah, we do want that, actually. We do want kind of equal outcomes in this sort of social, cultural sphere. This isn't about economics. But they haven't internalised that, nice as that might be in some ways, actually what it means is a massive bureaucracy of control, loads of petty commissars, lots of people who are the ones who get to decide what counts as equality, which groups are favoured, who's in, who's out. And you actually end up with a sort of deeply oppressive system that doesn't bring great equality and brings a great deal of resentment with it. So I think that's one of the ways that I think about this. It's sort of like a parallel kind of argument that sort of all the economic talk rather missed in a way, which is a great shame, but it has become a significant threat to liberty. I think also, going back to the New Left and sort of the fantasy world that it lived in, I think it was always a fantasy, and it was never quite something that could resolve itself, because what they said was, we are anti-totalitarian, by which they meant they rejected the realities of the communist system in Soviet Russia. They could see what that meant. Horrific totalitarian control and stifling. As early as the 60s and 70s, they were very clear on that. They rejected that, but they also rejected capitalism because they said, well, bourgeois capitalism is proto-fascism, so we have to reject that. Well, you might ask, what's left? Well, there wasn't. Most people might say, well, there was nothing left, but they said, it doesn't matter. We turn to the individual, we turn inwards. They're very interested in Freud as well as Marx. They were interested in sort of therapeutic language, and they just said, well, no, we will find this liberation by just tearing both down. And it wasn't clear that that was going to be possible or it led to anything. It really was a fantasy, I think. And also, it got caught between the idea of where does the control come from, because they rejected violence nominally, because they didn't want to be like Soviet Russia, they didn't want to be like fascists. But then how do you actually get what you want? Some of their members at the extreme fringe were terrorists, Baader Meinhof gang, people like that, because they kind of understood that really the logic of the new left was, well, someone's going to have to enforce this.
Yeah.
But even the mainstream of it, in cultural ways, always had to find some form of totalitarian control to do the work that they needed to do, which is why you get people like Herbert Marcuse, who was a key figure in that movement, talking about repressive tolerance, the idea that in order to get what we want, there are some people that we won't tolerate in order to get a more tolerant society. And there you see the roots of this idea of sort of cancel culture, if you like. It's like, to get what we want, well, we'll say we're not violent, okay, we won't be punching people, but we will intimidate people, we will drive people out. So there was sort of a new form of sort of violence at one remove, if you like, but that was still very much trying to control people by force.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned Marcuse in this respect, because he's put forward in that famous talk he gave, I think, at Brandeis University, where he said that there had to be, what was it called, repressive tolerance, whereby by repressing certain elements within the society who disagreed with the left, somehow this was going to result in tolerance, in liberation and emancipation. And you see that very much on the contemporary left today. I mean, I've got a quote here from a Labour MP called Nadia Whittome, who's part very much of the sort of new Corbynite, sort of momentumista sort of intake of Labour MPs. And she has said, we must not fetishise debate as though debate is itself an innocuous, neutral act. The very act of debate in these cases is an effective rollback of assumed equality and a foot in the door for doubt and hatred. Well, if you really believe what she's saying, then the more censorship you have, the more you prevent the narratives of the supposedly privileged and dominant, the more free the society is. So this is sort of an updating of Marcuse's kind of idea, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, I think, what we see today, cancel culture, if you want to call it that, I think of it sometimes as like the control left, or sort of, by sort of like comparison to the alt-right, maybe. It's the grandchild of the new left. It's a new kind of thing, perhaps even more anti-intellectual than Marcuse would have liked, perhaps much more focused on identity too, but very much an illiberal movement, and also fundamentally a revolutionary one. It wants to tear things apart, and that's really very dangerous, I think.
Going back to the discussion on or the references to fascism, it seems to me, or do you think this is overblown and overstating it, that actually this new type of post-rational emotivist left is actually, or it has kind of proto-fascistic potential if taken to its logical conclusion? I mean, von Hayek wrote about what he called atavism, and he said that all kind of collectivist movements were essentially an attempt to get back to a primitive sort of tribal form of existence, whereby a central controlling element within the tribe would be responsible for distributing rewards and punishments, and everybody would ultimately live sort of communally. And he didn't really see much of a distinction between communism and fascism or anarchism as ideologies, because they were all essentially anti-individualist. Is it overstating it to see new left politics as a long-term potential threat to the very foundations of liberal democracy?
they think they're individualists. Certainly Marcuse and people like that did, but they were really, I think, often, again, trying to square an impossible circle, how to become effectively a sort of totalitarian, a socialistic individualist. But individualism is opposed to socialism. That's where the words come from. So you can't really be both. Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, wrote about this, and he pointed out that one thing that the New Left did was move from going to the factories and trying to convert workers to, rise up as the proletariat, to the intellectuals, to the academics, and to say, well, we'll fight in university campuses for the soul of a university, and that's how we'll change things. And that, I think, was probably much more effective. But of course, that separates them out from the workers they're supposed to be helping. And as he pointed out, once you have a movement that says, well, it's in the name of the elite, it's the intellectuals for the workers to whom they have a mystical tie that they understand what they want, well, that is a rather fascistic way of thinking about the world. And of course, plenty of workers, particularly in the sort of Thatcher era, would rather have had a system where they were a bit freer and could, go and make their own life and make things good for themselves. And in a more contemporary way, we see, in the name of anti-fascism, the people like Antifa on the streets, well, these are little street armies of people in balaclavas and black uniforms beating people up. That doesn't seem like, that does indeed seem quite close to a sort of fascistic movement. So, yeah, I think there are definitely dangerous strains there. And there's another one, which is, again, it's in the name of anti-fascism, of punch a fascist, which are violence is normalised and acceptable against someone who's considered so hateful. So that was a thing a couple of years ago on social media. Well, no, but if it's a fascist, you can punch them and violence is appropriate. Well, none of us want like fascists, but of course, if everyone who supports the capitalist economy is effectively
right.
a fascist, then these things become a problem.
And I think you could extend this analysis to maybe a group like Extinction Rebellion, which give themselves the right not only to sort of take over cities without any democratic mandate, to use physical force to stop commuters going about their business, to shut down newspapers. I mean, famously, they did that in 2019. So they wanted to stop people being able to buy the Times and the Telegraph and goodness knows what else, the Scottish Sun, and a whole range of titles. And people like Diane Abbott and Dawn Butler, quite, very established Labour politicians, came out very publicly and said, this is great. They're the new suffragettes. They're the new hunger strikers of the 30s. Now, when you get fairly mainstream centre-left politicians lending their support to this kind of direct action, then you really are on a journey away from liberal democracy, aren't you?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a threat to it. And yeah, I mean, Extinction Rebellion, the whole business of trying to create and declare a climate emergency is about overriding democratic norms, saying, well, this is too important for us to have democratic
I think there were movements in the 30s that said, we're in this economic crisis and we've got to hand over all power to some...
What could possibly go wrong? I think that's definitely a real worry,
I'd like to close by asking you about your reference in the paper to Timur Kuran's theory of preference falsification and preference cascades, which is very fascinating, but I don't fully claim to have been able to understand it fully. And I was wondering if you would give us an introduction to what sounds a very interesting idea.
I think Timur Kuran's work is really worth people engaging with. Timur is a brilliant man. I think he probably should get the economics Nobel for the work that he did, but I don't know if he will. Perhaps there's still time. But he did this work about 25 years ago, and his book is very dense and quite difficult. But I would recommend that people go and read chapter 14 of his book, which is called Private Truths, Public Lies. Because that is about the corruption of American universities by a culture in which free speech becomes more and more difficult, and how that damages them intellectually. And I think you see the very beginnings of some of the things we've been talking about happening there. And it's fascinating, as we say, things happen over a long timescale, to see someone writing about it, perhaps more openly than you could now, but 25 years ago. But his general theory in that book is a dual preference theory. So he says something which I think we kind of all know, but he turns it into a theory, and he says, well, what you think internally is not necessarily what you say. You know, you may feel, well, I can't in front of my co-workers or in front of my friends or certain groups say everything that I feel. So I keep some things to myself, particularly if there's more of a culture externally that you're going to get in trouble for it. And when that starts to develop, so when you get cultures where you can't say what you think in public, private opinions get buried. And then you can have quite a lot of people who share a private opinion, but they have no idea who else has that opinion. And so this happened in Eastern Europe towards the end of communism. And so Timur Kuran has a very good explanation of why it happened so fast, that communism fell, and unexpectedly. No one saw it coming. And, you know, this is, you know, it's very true if you look at the detail. You can see people who were like shoveling coal one minute and were suddenly pulled from that because they were a dissident, and were then pulled to being, you know, foreign secretary or something the next afternoon. It was incredibly swift change. And Kuran's explanation is, he calls it a preference cascade, is when suddenly it breaks through and people find out, because they see in public, that, oh, other people think like me. And then suddenly it all switches and everyone realises what the new thing that's acceptable to say in public is, or that it's acceptable to say actually communism is a crock of crap and doesn't work and I hate it. And suddenly you won't find anyone who will admit to having been a dyed-in-the-wool communist all these years. So it's a fascinating theory, really developed to talk about totalitarian systems and very good at explaining that. But I think it really speaks to our contemporary moment. It speaks to a time when you're not being allowed, or lots of people feel that they can't say what they really think in public, or to challenge some postmodern attempt to impose a new truth. And so that's quite a dangerous time, because ideas get buried and people don't know what other people think. And also because you do get these sudden disjunctions, so things might change quite fast. So that's quite unstable. And I think, just as maybe a final thought, is what happens when you can't say what you think in public is that ideas get lost too as well. Towards the end of communism, people in the East often couldn't think that, oh, there's a free market way to solve this, simply because all of those ideas had been driven out. And I suspect there are probably corners of the academy today, or perhaps large parts of, you know, the Quangos and so forth, where people don't know really that there might be a freer way to do things. They're only stuck within the paradigm that has become acceptable to mention.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating theory, and I think that the way in which the New Left and their sort of fellow travellers within, you know, big corporations, the public sector, the police and what have you, have employed the concept of hate speech speaks to what you're saying, because if you brand a whole load of positions which have nothing actually to do with inciting physical violence against particular groups of people, but are simply political positions on, say, the trans issue, but if you brand that successfully as being a form of hate speech, which is what is happening with the police turning up at people's houses if they've, you know, sent out a tweet about this issue, which doesn't correspond to the official, doesn't correspond with the zeitgeist on this, then you will get people, presumably, according to what Kuran has been saying, dismissing the whole idea of having a transgender critical position, because that will have become emotionally and irrationally associated with being hateful when it's not. Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think, you know, what we're saying about violence too, once you start saying that acts of speech are effectively a form of violence,
you're losing the ability to have the debate, because what is that? But then what are your options left if all debate is a form of violence? So really what you're saying is that violence is no worse than saying something mean about someone, at which point, well, why not start punching people and have violence? So I think, you know, there are very dangerous things here. We need the ability to talk about difficult topics and have exchanges where we have very different views. And when you don't have that, well, you open up all sorts of very dangerous avenues indeed.
Marc, thank you very much for joining us. Again, it's been fascinating to talk to you about these issues. Marc's paper, A Silent Revolution, can be downloaded from the IEA website, and his book, The Long March, can be downloaded from the New Culture Forum. That's still the case, isn't it?
That's still the case, yes. There is a Kindle e-book as well, if people prefer that.
Right. So thank you for watching, and thank you, Marc Sidwell, for talking to me.
Pleasure. Thank you,
Thank
Marc.
you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.